Well, first of all, to the best of my knowledge, we do not have evidence of an exodus at all. Now, I mean, there are two different questions there, really. Sometimes when people ask about the Exodus, they're thinking of the crossing of the sea. Now, I think the crossing of the sea is, a rather obvious, how would I put it, myth, tall tale. There is a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, by a rabbi named Harold Kushner, in which he tells a joke about the kid who comes home from Jewish Sunday school, if you like, and the father asks him, "What did you learn?" And he said, "Oh, about how the Israelites escaped from Egypt, and how they came to this body of water, and then the Israeli Air Force came in and bombed the Egyptians and rescued them." And the father said, "Did you really? Is that really what they told you?" He said, "No, but if I told you what they told me, nobody would believe it." I grew up in Ireland, in a very small place. When I was 12 years old, I got a scholarship to a boarding school that was run by a religious order. In those days, everybody did Latin, and the dean of students called out 12 of us and told us, "You're going to do Greek." Now, two of us stayed with the Greek for 5 years. At the end of that time, I joined that religious order. I subsequently left, but I joined it initially. And uh, when I went along to go to the university, the dean of students there asked me, "What would you like to study?" And I said, "Classics." And he said, "Well, you can study classics if you'll also learn Hebrew, and then you can teach scripture." And so that's how I became an Old Testament scholar. Uh, I didn't have any prior, it's very superficial knowledge of the Bible before that. Catholics aren't very Bible-centered. But then, since my primary interest really was in the classical world, I my interest focused on Hellenistic Judaism, where the two cultures met. Now, as it turned out, my Hebrew professor was much more engaging than my classics professors. So uh, that was the way I went. And then he got the order to allow me to go on for a PhD. And the advice he got from a man named Harry Orlinsky was to go to Harvard and work with Strudnell. And so that is what I did.
Beautiful. So you were kind of interested in the classical world as well, right? Beside Old Testament.
And in fact, I wrote my dissertation on the Sibylline oracles of
Wow.
Egyptian Judaism.
Beautiful.
You may have difficulty finding the Sibylline oracles in your Old Testament.
Yes, yes, it's very hard. Yeah.
But
Thank you.
that was in fact what I did.
Beautiful,
And
beautiful. Dr. Collins, let me ask you this, and this is a little bit critical for me, but because some people ask me to ask you, let me start by asking this one. So many critical Old Testament scholars point out that a part of Scripture, especially in the early narratives, contain elements of legend or myth. If that's true, what kind of truth does this text still communicate in? In other words, how can something that isn't always strictly historical still be regarded as a word of God?
well, as a biblical scholar, you deal with the Bible as a human product. Now, if you believe it's inspired, fine, but it's still written in the language of a particular time and place, and it's written in such a way as to be, first of all, intelligible to people in that time and place. And the books that we have in the Hebrew Bible were written in ancient Israel or Judah, and they're informed by the history and culture of that time. Now, one of the ways in which people communicated religious truths in the ancient world is by making myths. by telling stories, often fantastical stories. But that's a mode of communication. It's, they were not positivists. These were people who lived long before any scientific revolution. They did not make the kind of rigid distinction between fact and fiction that people tend to make in the modern world. And so I don't think it was a problem for them to deal in hyperbole, if you like.
So when when we read, like, let's say, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then beside that we read like Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh. So the question that some people ask, okay, does the authors of the Genesis using those sources to keep up with their idea of Yahweh and God, does they any influence of these epic on the book of Genesis? And if yes, so the question from people who see the Bible as a word of God still remain, okay, what type of truth is that the author of Genesis is using Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh? So how can we understand?
It's the same kind of truth that you get from reading Shakespeare or any great literature. And, how good it is may be a matter of opinion, a matter of your judgment. But that is the kind of truth you can expect to get from it. You do not get scientific truth from the opening chapters of Genesis. Bear in mind, as I say, believe what you like about it being inspired, but it was certainly written in Hebrew, in the Hebrew that was intelligible in, say, roughly 500 BC, and you could not express what modern scientists believe in Hebrew as it was spoken in 500 BC. The language hadn't developed that capability as yet. And so that's the kind of truth that you get. Now, the story of Adam and Eve, I think, is a wonderful story. It captures something about human nature, the power of temptation. It's an ageless story in that regard. But, it has a talking snake. When you meet a story with a talking animal, we call such stories fables. The Greek author Aesop wrote a lot of them, and a lot of them were very good. So that's the kind of truth you're dealing with. There are definitely echoes of Gilgamesh in the story of Adam and Eve. And in Genesis chapter 1, I have a colleague here at Yale, Eckhart Fromm, who is an Assyriologist, who has written arguing for the influence of the Enuma Elish on Genesis chapter 1.
Wow. So, because a couple of weeks ago, I asked the same question from Dr. Longman, the same questions about what he thinks about the influence of Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh in the book of Genesis. And then he said that he doesn't think that there is any influence. And then he believes that there is a probably common source in between. But not like directly.
I'm not suggesting that whoever wrote Genesis had a big tablet with Enuma Elish on a desk beside him. But I think he knew some parts of the story. But he didn't. I don't know whether. I have no real reason to think that any of them knew specific Akkadian texts. It's not that close an influence. But these were stories that circulated. It is very common in our own experience that we know smatterings of stories. It doesn't mean we understand them in their own context or are even interested in them in their own context. But those are the kind of influences you typically pick up because, the biblical authors weren't interested in interpreting the Enuma Elish. They were making their own story. And if they got an idea that sounded good to them in the Enuma Elish, they would use that. And they didn't care whether that was what the author of Enuma Elish meant.
Hmm. Yeah, another question, the question of historicity of Exodus always puzzled me. So many people wonder about the historicity based on the Exodus story, the slavery in Egypt, the crossing Red Sea, and 40 years in wilderness wandering.
Yeah.
From that standpoint, from the standpoint of archaeology and critical scholarship, do we have evidence of these events as described? And if not, what do you think the biblical authors were trying to communicate here?
Well, first of all, to the best of my knowledge, we do not have evidence of an exodus at all. Now,
Hmm.
I mean, there are two different questions there, really. Sometimes when people ask about the Exodus, they're thinking of the crossing of the sea.
Yep.
Now, I think the crossing of the sea is, a rather obvious, how would I put it, myth,
Okay.
tall tale. There is a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, by a rabbi named Harold Kushner, in which he tells a joke about the kid who comes home from Jewish Sunday school, if you like, and the father asked him, "What did you learn?" And he said, "Oh, about how the Israelites escaped from Egypt, and how they came to this body of water, and then the Israeli Air Force came in and bombed the Egyptians and rescued them." And the father said, "Did you really? Is that really what they told you?" He said, "No, but if I told you what they told me, nobody would believe it." So, so I think, the story of the crossing of the sea really is a play. One of my teachers was Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, and one of his famous articles was "The Song of the Sea and Canaanite Myth," because in the Canaanite myth, the god Baal defeats the sea, splits the sea. And I think they're playing on that motif. And it's quite demonstrable, I think, that you start out with a poem, which, doesn't have to be taken literally. And then somebody wrote the next chapter, the prose account of the crossing of the sea, in chapter 14 of the book of Exodus, as an attempt to translate the poetry into a prosaic account, taking it quite literally. So that part, I think you can discount easily enough, and it shouldn't really bother anybody. But which bigger question is, was there an exodus out of Egypt at all? And on that one, I find it hard to think that the whole story was made up out of whole cloth. But I don't really know how much cloth they had to work with. There were a lot of people from the area of Israel who were slaves in Egypt from time to time and who escaped. But was there one big one like this? Now, my authority on this is a man named Bill Deaver, an archaeologist. I don't know if you've ever come across him. Very forceful man. Rather conservative, actually, relative to some other people. But he says, no, it just didn't happen. There is no archaeological evidence, because if the Israelites had come out of Egypt, you would expect a lot of Egyptian artifacts, pottery especially, to show up in Israel. And it doesn't.
You mean
So
Doc?
that's
Doc
his conclusion on it. But,
yeah, Doc, Doctor.
I would figure nonetheless there's probably some basis to it.
Dr. Collins, you mean that we do? I mean, outside of the biblical text, there is no proof of other uh, text in ancient world that even mention that these moving from Egypt to wilderness and then at
That's
there's
right.
nothing.
That we have another account of the origins of Israel or Judah, written by a man named Manetho, but that down in the Hellenistic period, so about 1,000 years after the Exodus should have happened. But, that is actually a fairly blatantly polemical account. And it is, it's Moses is leading a group of lepers. and they're expelled. Uh, so I don't think anybody would argue that Manetho should be taken seriously. But at least he had a story that supposed that the Israelites had been in Egypt and came out. How much you can do with that, I don't know. You know, my colleague Joel Baden is working on a commentary on Exodus. And
Yeah,
if you want to
I think I have.
he would be the
Mhm.
man to take it up with.
Yeah. So yeah, I read some of his work on Exodus, the small books, but not a big commentary that he's working on yet. So speaking about uh those big's name in the Old Testament, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So do you think even those names or those patriarch are kind of not historical like figures in the
Yeah.
history back
I
then?
would figure that there surely were people named Abraham and people named Isaac and people named Jacob. These must have been names that were not exceptional. Can you assume that any of the things told of them actually happened? No. You know, if you think of somebody like George Washington, can you believe everything you read about him? And, with the add a couple of thousand years of an interval, and people tend to make things up. And people tend to attach stories to different names. And you can see that in the Bible. There's a famous story that basically the same story occurs three times with some variations, where the patriarch, first of all, Abraham, goes down into Egypt, and the Pharaoh takes a fancy to his wife. And then they play it out in different ways. But then, the same thing happens again with the Philistines. And, I think that this is obviously the way folklore works. Stories get transferred. And this, doesn't need to be a problem. It's only a problem if you come to it with wrong generic expectations.
Yeah, I
If
think.
you pick up a novel or if you go to a movie, you don't go in saying either this happened exactly like this or it's no good at all.
So
Even
oh,
when it's describing a more or less historical event.
okay, Collins, how about the original audience of like Genesis? Do they take these event as a history or more as a like theological events?
Well, you see, I think they had a different idea of history. Critical history is a relatively recent invention. Now, you get glimmers of it in Herodotus and Thucydides, but it's really, German historians in the 19th century who clamped down on that and said, you got to have evidence, you got to verify what you say. But in the ancient world, and I think in most traditional societies, people aren't that rigid about it. You learn the stories of your national heroes, whoever they happen to be, and you tell these stories without worrying. So, the problem with the question that you put to me is people weren't asking that question in antiquity. I mean, certainly not in ancient Israel, and very few people even in ancient Greece.
Hmm. Thank you, Dr. Collins. So let's move to another question about apocalypticism. So you have spent much of your career exploring apocalyptic literature. What first drew you to that, and why do you think these texts continue to fascinate readers today? That's why you wrote a lot on on these
Indeed,
texts.
indeed, yes, and I've had occasion to reflect on it a couple of times lately. Um, you know, as I told you already, I came to the subject with a background in classics, and so I was interested in the Hellenistic period. And one of the things that comes up in the Hellenistic period is apocalypticism. in the book of Daniel, for example, and then when you move on a little bit and learn about the books of Enoch and all of that kind of stuff. So that is how I got to be interested in it. When I was a student at Harvard, Paul Hansen had just finished his dissertation called The Dawn of Apocalyptic. And he taught a seminar. Now, I fought with him on every detail of it, but I learned an enormous amount from it because it stimulated me. That's what really stirred up my interest in it. And then when I wrote on Sibylline oracles, because, over against Paul thought the dawn of apocalyptic was in the exilic period, or right after the exile. And I was arguing that no, it was in the Hellenistic period, in the time of the Maccabees. And so when I wrote my dissertation on the Sibylline oracles, I was looking for, a Hellenistic example of something like apocalyptic literature. But anyhow, that's what got me started in it. What now? Somebody asked me there a week or two ago, what do you learn from it? Well, you learn a couple of things. First of all, in general, everything ends. That's an obvious fact, really. I think it is something that people like, say, the present US government would do well to bear in mind. Maybe the current Iranian government, too. You may have power, you may have it for a long time, but it will end.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure.
Thank you. Thank you
Now,
for saying that.
that's one point. A second point is it may take a long time before it ends. You may feel that it's got to end now, but it doesn't always happen that way. It could go on for a couple of 100 years. And then no end is final. There is always something. Now, I don't know if you have ever read a novel by a man named Cormac McCarthy, The Road. It was also made into a film, I believe. But this would be what you might call a post-apocalyptic novel. The world has been destroyed, and this man and his son are wandering in the kind of landscape you might expect to have after a nuclear war. And then just at the end of it, he sees a little flower. Well, in all apocalyptic texts, something comes after the end. And to my mind, one of the mistakes people make in studying apocalypticism is they're all concerned about the crash. And it's really what comes after it you should be concerned with. And what comes after it in the Jewish texts ultimately is the resurrection of the dead, or the exaltation of the dead to heaven. You may get a messianic kingdom on earth, but if you do, it's limited. In 4th Ezra, it lasts 400 years. In the book of Revelation, it lasts 1,000 years. But there's the real good stuff comes after it. And ultimately, what apocalypticism is about is the conquest of death. In the so-called Apocalypse of Isaiah, one of the earliest, at least quasi-apocalyptic texts, it says that God will destroy death forever. That is the hope that drives the apocalyptic literature, and it will remain a vital hope until it is accomplished. And frankly, I don't expect that it ever will be accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for that too. So, I know beside the apocalyptic imagination or things like that you wrote a lot. So you work on Dead Sea Scroll too. So I have one question about Dead Sea Scroll. The discovery of Dead Sea Scroll transformed our understanding of Judaism in the time of Jesus. From your perspective, what are the most important ways the scroll have reshaped the picture?
Well, for one thing, they've just given us a lot more literature in the original languages than we had before. Now, there had been a we had basically, I would say, two views of Judaism in that period. There was the old one associated with George Foot Moore of normative Judaism, which is the assumption that when all was said and done, the main thing for all Jews was to keep the law. Now, even though the idea of normative Judaism has been debunked many times, an awful lot of scholars still think that way, in fact. The alternative to it was that all this apocalyptic stuff that wasn't preserved by the rabbis, but that was preserved by Christians, that tells you what Judaism was like in the period around Jesus. Now, you'd have some people, and especially some Jewish scholars, who would say that stuff isn't real Judaism at all. It's all preserved by Christians and could have been composed centuries later. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found large parts of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. We didn't find all of this literature, but at least we found enough to know that that kind of literature was alive and well. And
Hmm.
not only in the Book of Enoch, but some of the texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we didn't know of at all before. Things like the War Scroll, are talking about demons and angels in conflict and a final battle and so forth. So there was a strand of Judaism that was apocalyptic. But it is also true that the Dead Sea Scrolls show that there was an intense interest in the law, sometimes even by the same people. So the idea that it was one or the other doesn't work. Actually, what it shows is that Judaism at the time was much more diverse than people had given it credit for being.
Hmm.
So that's one big thing. Another big thing is that the text of the Bible wasn't really settled until maybe the end of the 1st century AD, but
Yes.
that people were still chopping and changing. That a scribe copying a book of the Bible could feel free to make changes
Hmm.
down in the time of Jesus. And that was startling.
Nice. Dr. Collins, I myself, I heard that many scholars, especially Old Testament scholars, critical Old Testament scholars, saying that Isaiah 53, in the eyes of Jews at the time, never should be interpreted as a Messiah, as Jesus. So, what's your perspective, and what do you think? Why New Testament authors sometimes it seems they're referring to that servant of God as we interpret it as Jesus. So what do you think about Isaiah 53 in the
I
context
think,
of New Testament?
first of all, those scholars are basically right. You do not find references to Isaiah 53 as a messianic text in Jewish texts of the time. Why would Christians have read it that way? I think Christians read it because of what actually happened to Jesus. That it seemed just an awfully good fit. Now, I don't think anybody got the idea that Jesus must have been the Messiah because of Isaiah 53. I think those people had already believed that he was the Messiah. But then, if you already believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and you see him get crucified, go through the kinds of sufferings described in Isaiah 53, that's what leads them to interpret Isaiah 53 as a messianic text.
So another question: do you think that the idea of Messiah in Old Testament and the pseudepigrapha, almost in every literature that we have, anywhere in the literature talking about Messiah to be divine?
Oh, yes. I mean, the Messiah, already in the Psalms, the king is called my anointed one, which is Mashiach. And in Psalm 2, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So that's part of the old royal ideology, that the king is the son of God. Now, what does that mean? I don't think it means that, you know, that he was conceived in an unusual way, let's say. It is a way of expressing the special status of the king in relation to God. I don't think it's true to say that they were thinking that the God had adopted the king. They wanted it stronger than that. And I think that this idea originally came from Egypt, in my opinion. So, yes, you do have the idea that the king is, or the Messiah is the Son of God. It's not very common, but you have it 3 or 4 times.
Understand. So, I mean, when you're saying that the Isaiah 53 in the eyes of Christians should be interpreted as Jesus as that figure. So the question is it not that it's quite an interesting way of seeing those Isaiah 53? It seems that it's describing exactly what happened to Christ on a cross. If the I mean, my point is, if it's not about Jesus, who was that figures in the eyes of Jews at the time of Isaiah that
Well,
is
let's go back to the first thing I said in this conversation. These things were written in a certain time and place. Isaiah 53 was probably written somewhere around the year 540, 530 maybe, somewhere towards the end of the Babylonian exile. Now, nobody at that point was anticipating Jesus. There were people who were anticipating a Messiah, but a Messiah would be somebody who would restore the kingdom of Judah. That's what people expected. Now, Isaiah 53 doesn't look like that at all. Now, I assume that Isaiah 53 was written in a way that was supposed to make sense to the people of the time. And, I mean, to my mind, it's most probably Israel in the exile is the suffering servant. There are different theories on that. Some people think maybe it was the last king or maybe it was the prophet. But I think the one that requires us, to believe least over and above what's explicit, that requires least hypothesis, is to say that it was Israel during the exile. And, read that way, then it was claiming, and this was a tremendously important idea and tremendously influential later on, that suffering can be redemptive. Because that is not an idea you get earlier in the Hebrew Bible, but I think it was introduced there with reference to why did the Judeans have to go through this experience, the virtual death of their nation.
beautiful.
So
So,
that, I think, is what that was originally about.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. So, and the last question that I ask from almost every guest that I have on my podcast, Dr. Collins, you have shaped generation of students through your own writing, but I would like to ask you what books or scholar most shape you as a scholar today?
Well, now that's a difficult question, but there are two. I just gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to retirees at Yale. Uh, we take turns doing this, like telling the story of what we did. And there were two books that I mentioned in that case. One was Peter Berger, The Sacred Canopy, which is a sociological view of religion as something that human beings construct. And the other was Van Harvey, The Historian and the Believer. Have you ever read that?
No, but I think I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Well, I recommend it strongly.
Okay.
I
Uh-huh.
found that book had a huge influence on me, and it relates directly to some of the questions you were asking. Now,
Beautiful.
Harvey doesn't go into the virtues of mythological writing. He's just focusing on, if you want to make a hard distinction between fact and fiction, how do you do it? And it doesn't matter whether you're in a court of law or reading the Gospels. The rules of evidence are the same. Either you have evidence and reason to believe it, or you don't. Now, people will still argue as to what are valid reasons to believe something. But, your belief is as good as the legs it stands on. There is
Beautiful.
no virtue in just believing something.
Okay. Beautiful, Dr. Collins.
Muslims believe things just as much as Christians do.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Collins, we'll be expecting you to write a new book or something that coming.
Well, I have a book actually in press at the moment on apocalypticism as a worldview.
Okay.
And you got a couple of snippets of that.
Okay, beautiful, nice. Very
I
good,
still
very good.
want to write a book on the Bible and human rights.
Wow, nice. I always talk to my wife and say, just imagine that you have Dr. Collins and his wife on a breakfast, and then you're asking questions. You have an encyclopedia of New Testament, Old Testament, just lively talking to you. And it's a privilege for me to have you today. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope you have a very good day. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.